Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Stuart Cohen. I'm the president of IGI Cyber Labs. We're going to get started in just a couple of minutes, just waiting for some of your colleagues to log in. Today, we are fortunate enough to have a couple of great guests with us on today's panel as part of our partnership with Gradient, talking today about how do MSPs can move their clients into cyber services beyond IT support. This is a critical topic as people have had desktop support for years, and now they're trying to figure out what they need to do to keep their data safe and secure. How do they handle continuity? How do they handle business systems? How do they handle availability of systems? So should be a great conversation. We've got some questions that are submitted in advance, so we'll get to those in a second. But with that, I just want to move on to a couple of topics from a housekeeping standpoint. We want to keep this as interactive as possible. So do me a favor, please put your questions in the chat box. Put them in as chats, put them in as questions. We'll make sure we do our best to get to all of them. We will rebroadcast this, so it will be on our YouTube channel. So you'll have the ability to review it later. You can also send your peers and colleagues to it. If you have additional questions, please go to our LinkedIn events page, ask questions. We'll make sure as a community we are responding to those, and you get an opportunity to dialogue and collaborate with your peers as well. So we want to make this interactive. We obviously have some things we want to talk about today as part of the chat, but feel free to support any questions you have. So with that, let me talk about a couple of things. As you know, this session, for those of you that have been on others with us, this is really about a public service announcement, if you will, an opportunity to talk about how do we help the MSP marketplace grow? How do we help the MSPs support more end users and more clients? And with the frequency of cyber attacks, the number of new compliance requirements and new regulatory requirements, what can MSPs do to be ready? How do they be better prepared? Because it's not just the president, the CEO, the COO, or if there's an IT person at the organization, but now maybe it's a board member. Now maybe it's an investor. Now maybe it's a customer or supply chain client that wants to make sure their data is secure, and they want to make sure that if the organization is using an MSP to provide them assistance, their data is kept secure, and they don't have a concern about that. These are about those kind of conversations that we're having today. If you want to see a demonstration of Nodeware itself, you want to ask one of your peers a couple of questions, we will have that session coming up on the 27th, and we're happy to show you the product, talk to you a little bit about what continuous monitoring means, how do you handle normal business hour activities, as the world has changed dramatically with the frequency of attacks and the compliance and regulatory items coming your way. Next on the line is around compliance and the FTC safeguard itself. There are auto dealerships and RV dealerships and marine dealerships all over the country that are now having to comply with the FTC safeguard that's supposed to be put in place by all these organizations by December 9th. We have a couple of people with us. We have Jim from SDP Compliance, and we have Molly Moore from Meriplex talking about some of the things they're doing to help assist both on the IT and cybersecurity side, as well as on the automotive and auto industry side to be prepared for that compliance. Great opportunity to talk about how compliance is changing what small businesses need to do, not only to be successful, but what they need to do to stay in business with everything that's coming their way. So with that, we'll get to today's conversation. If we can go to the next slide. So we're fortunate enough to have Matt Topper with us. He's the Director of Security at Gradient. Gradient is a leading provider integrating MSPs with the billing systems and other systems that Gradient has to offer, integrated into the MSPs to make them more productive, make them more efficient. We're lucky enough to have Matt with us today. Matt, let me introduce Nick, and then I'll turn it over to you, and you could say a few words about Gradient specifically and your background and your perspective. We're also fortunate to have Nick McCourt, who's the vCISO at Integris, rolling out their cybersecurity programs to their clients that are upgrading from their IT desktop support services or new businesses that are coming their way that are looking for local assistance and support as Integris grows across the country with their scale and with their capacity. So, Matt, let me go to you first. Maybe give us a little bit of perspective coming from the MSP world. How do MSPs grasp with the idea of, you provided IT support or desktop support, and now you either want to move to providing those kind of cyber hygiene solutions, or maybe you're being demanded or asked to provide those kind of services?
Yeah, great question, Stuart. And I think it's both. I think if you look at the market, the desire is to start moving into that, and for most of the customer base, there's a need to, both from customer expectation perspective and from hard requirements such as customers that have regulatory obligations. It's really becoming a need to do if you're not already doing and providing that type of service. The transition is difficult, especially as you start to have a requirement to do things that are relatively complicated kind of out of nowhere, right? So if you're used to just installing the workstation or upgrading the server, doing all that type of work, and suddenly you're asked to put together an entire information security program, that is a big, big leap. And it can be hard for you as a service provider to figure out how to do that and how to start down that road. And the thing that I'll probably say more than once is that one of the only ways, or really there are two ways to do that, and that is to either go out and find someone who has experience doing that, or to start to develop your own experience being cognizant of what you can and can't do at that stage in the journey. And I think that's one of the things we can try and answer during this presentation, during this discussion, is how do you figure out where you are along that journey? And it's not necessarily easy or obvious, and it requires being a little humble and honest with yourself about your current capabilities.
So, Nick, maybe you can elaborate a little bit on that. As an organization that was doing desktop support only, and now you start looking at the myriad of things that small businesses will need local assistance and support from their MSP. How do you kind of wade into, if you will, maybe the simple pieces of multi-factor authentication and vulnerability management and a little bit of education, all the way up to kind of a full-blown, to your point, vCISO and cyber hygiene program?
Well, the concept essentially is to grow with the business. As organizations come our way, some of them or all of them are in different stages. And, the benefits of working with a managed service provider are pretty simple, right? If you're trying to build your own staff, you have budget for a certain number of people. This is what, you can handle, that sort of thing. Working with a managed service provider, they're actually providing you with multiple staff. And so, interesting enough, the concept of security services now has, grown from a set it and forget it type of mentality and gone into a program-based approach where, sure, multi-factor authentication is good when you're first coming in, but, liability insurance requirements don't state just MFA anymore. Now it says, yeah, we want ongoing vulnerability management. We want it continuously, we want it monthly. They're dropping off the requirements of every 6 months. They're dropping off the requirements for quarterly. They're saying, hey, I want this to happen all the time. And so, as an organization scales up, as they become more and more public, their security needs to grow in that direction. And so for managed service providers, this becomes an integral part of what they're doing as far as the services they're providing.
It's an interesting point. How do businesses respond, right? If you look back even 12 months ago, right? If you were concerned about the NIST framework or you were worried about CIS 18, it used to say you needed a vulnerability management report, and then it went to a vulnerability management plan, and then it went to you need continuous vulnerability management and remediation plans to be well documented in order to get to the stage 1 data gathering, if you will, from a NIST standpoint. You know, how have MSPs, adapted to that pretty rapid change of an offering, and at the same time, explaining to their customers how much more sophisticated and time consuming it is to provide that, both on the MSP side and on the client side?
Well, I think there's a couple answers here, and let's just be frank. The reality is that a lot of MSPs and organizations have done this by trying to go find a pre-canned document or checklist or something that makes your incident response plan or vulnerability management plan, and haven't gotten to the mindset that, the requirement to have these documents isn't just to, like, for the sake of doing paperwork. If you think about it properly, and it's worth going through the exercise and really writing your vulnerability management plan and your IR plan and all of the associated policies and documents that go with that. And you said it, Stuart, it's a big amount of work to do this the right way, to sit down and have the conversations with your customers and clients about what an incident would look like, what a vulnerability detection would look like, what systems you even need to monitor for vulnerabilities, and having all of that. And I think we're seeing a multiple steps or multiple phases in this, right? And it's good to get your templates and get your things if your goal is simply to satisfy the requirements. But if your goal is to really take this for the spirit of the requirement, if you will, it takes a lot more work than that.
Nick, you look like you were ready to say something.
Oh, no, no, Matt already covered it. So thank you, Matt. That was good. Vulnerability management is something that managed service providers have been struggling for years to try to figure out. At the end of the day, if you're talking about whether you're talking about the actual plans or whether you're talking about deploying an actual vulnerability management service, there's always a couple of things that can go wrong, right? You can have it where the system doesn't work correctly and it fails, and maybe somebody set it up, but historically, and I mentioned it already for multi-factor authentication and some of the stuff before, it's always been the set it and forget it thing. Let's set this up. This is going to run. I'll see you later. And there's too much human interaction actually involved with vulnerability management, for example. I think that at the end of the day, you can have you need a great service that does continuous scanning. You need it to be able to spread out, whether the organization is brick and mortar or whether they are hybrid or whether they are all remote. And then having that, you have to have somebody experienced taking a look at it and actually advising not only the client, but also advising your infrastructure teams, the service teams taking care of the client and going, hey, this vulnerability is showing up, but the reason why is it's not your fault here. You're pushing your patching on a regular basis. Your patching cadence is right, but you're going to have to go talk to the client and say, hey, Mr. or Mrs. CEO, whomever in the C-suite, whomever in operations, I need you to reboot your computer, right? I know you're traveling a lot, but you're just putting your computer to sleep. You're not actually rebooting it. And I need you to change that. So there's a lot that goes into this. And I think even now there are a lot of managed service providers that struggle to figure out how to implement this correctly.
To that point, as organizations, CEOs, COOs, CFOs know they need to do things to be compliant, do they make the connection, or is it the MSP that's kind of required to educate them that in order for you to be compliant and us to assist you, there are some cybersecurity things you're going to have to do above and beyond, processes and procedures within your own organization?
It's both, right? I think the only thing you can really expect, and even this is not always the case, but for the organization is to know what regulations they may fall under, and even then they might not always know. But assuming you get that, it is a joint effort between the MSP and the client, the customer, in figuring out what needs to happen to get from A to B. And a lot of it is expectation setting, right? If you take your typical client, there's a good chance that they assume that everything on that list of regulations or list of configuration settings and everything is already being done. And so starting from as soon as the client realizes, or is during your quarterly business reviews with them, talk about compliance and figure out, is there anything upcoming that you need to be aware of, so that you don't get to the point of, here's this questionnaire, I assume we're good. That's just not a good place for anyone to be in.
Well, to that point, what happens if the MSP, doesn't feel comfortable? If the organization doesn't want to implement the things that the MSP recommends them to do, what does the MSP do if the recommendations aren't taken, they're not approved, they're not contracted, yet the belief is the MSP is on the hook to be responsible?
That's a really good. I'll let Nick go first. I think he. I suspect similar opinions.
Thanks for throwing me under the bus there, man. I appreciate it. Yeah, I think, Stuart, it's one of those things where, working for an MSP, we actually have this, the analogy is, the seatbelt of security. Basically, here's the required items needed for us to even provide services to you. And I used to get some mixed responses on this, but at the end of the day, interestingly enough, if an organization is not investing in their own technology in this age, in this time, then their longevity is actually in question. And managed service providers want to provide services for organizations that want to invest in themselves. Okay, sure, it's a financial plus, but it's also just in general, it's a focus on growth. It's a focus on productivity. Organizations that do not want to have those things, they usually don't stay around very long anyway. Oftentimes what we'll see is that the organization, and we've seen this, the organization may leave on their own accord, and then they come back. In fact, it's one of the most fascinating things to think, oh, well, so-and-so has decided to leave because, we've recommended all these things and they've said no, and they found somebody else who provides something less expensive. Well, we weren't trying to be expensive, but we were trying to provide the best services possible. And so at the end of the day, when they go somewhere else and they go, oh, well, I'm getting basic, right? I'm getting basic services, but I'm actually not getting somebody coming in and saying, hey, your technology, no matter what industry you're in, your technology, it has some objectives tied into it. You have objectives with what you're using. And so, yeah, overall, if they say no, or they don't want to do that, then oftentimes, nicer managed service providers may stay around and continue to try to enforce, but at some point the risk becomes too high for a managed service provider who is expected, right? The C-suite expects the managed service provider to do this, regardless of what is written in a managed services agreement or a contract. We expect you to do X. Well, if you're not actually investing in the services that allow us to do that, then at some point, we're going to have to end the relationship, and maybe we can come back when you're ready.
Agreed. And I think on the responsibility front, it's a good opportunity or good practice to remind the customers and clients that an organization is responsible for its own compliance. You may outsource parts of it for your technology portions. Your MSP may be responsible for a lot of the technical parts, but ultimately you need to be responsible for your compliance, and if you're not, the organization, are who's going to face the accountability. And you may try and look at your managed services agreement and go after your MSP for not meeting expectations, but chances are adherence to regulation X wasn't in your MSA to begin with. It would be a pretty difficult fight. And so getting clients to that mindset ahead of time and just reminding them that you may name us in your incident response plan, versus you just hand off the entire responsibility of incident response to us, is a good way to level set that expectation from the beginning, and making them realize that they're still responsible for it, and you as the MSP are here to help with as many things as you can and as many things as they'll let you, but ultimately you are an extension of the core organization. You're not just delegating compliance to a different entity. You can't actually do that.
To that point, do you think the market can bifurcate where the MSP provides, if you will, desktop support, and if my app doesn't open, I call that line and they help me out with what I have to do, and and at the same time, another organization, provides a virtual cybersecurity officer or a part-time cybersecurity consultant or expert. So you could get the cybersecurity side on one side of your business, and you could get the desktop support from somebody else. Can the world bifurcate that way, or are they too entwined?
Personally, I think they're too entwined. I think what you can do is some of what Nick does, where you have cybersecurity as a part of an organization that you overall contract your IT services to. But as far as completely separate entities and organizations, what you end up with is kind of nobody taking the lead if you go that route.
Ooh, okay, I can see that. No, I think we're actually we've been exploring that over the past couple of years, interesting enough. And one thing I will say, Stuart, you can actually, and I know this because we're already taking care of organizations from this perspective, but we do have a virtual chief information security officer or a fractional CISO essentially coming in. And you may have an organization that has their own managed service provider, and it actually adds to some balance. The purpose of that fractional CISO or that virtual CISO is, regardless of whether you as the client are receiving services from us as a managed service provider, or whether you're receiving from another managed service provider, there's an interesting balance. There's a component there that a chief information security officer can provide. In the meantime, as Matt mentioned, there's a lot of other security services that actually, they are intertwined. I think one of the things that I can't stand, interesting enough, is I don't like it when managed security service providers come in and do vulnerability management, but the managed service provider isn't, because really the weight of the patching, the weight of the remediation, the weight of all of that falls on the managed service provider. And so, and somebody told me, actually, this was only a couple of days ago, they're like, well, isn't it a conflict of interest? I said, no. I think about it from the perspective of a managed service provider. You don't want to be on the hook in the incident management plan. You don't want to sit there in the course of due diligence and it shows that, hey, you were provided with a vulnerability report and you did not remediate, even though it was your job to patch all of those systems. And so really for managed service providers, this actually becomes, it's a business opportunity. It's also a protective benefit for managed service providers to actually, be intertwined with this, as Matt mentioned.
What about from an end user standpoint? If you're running a small business, right? You're the CEO or COO. Can you try and separate the functions and have an MSP do the desktop work and the IT support, and maybe hire a consultant to help implement some of the security things and potentially direct the MSP to do that, or make the two of them work together?
You can do that. It becomes a maturity exercise, right? All of the parties involved need to be a pretty high operational maturity level for that to work, because you get to someone having to make the decision from the client's perspective. Is this something I call my MSP for? Is this something I call my MSSP for? And it can be difficult to coordinate. Now, if everybody is at a high level and understands the separation, and it was spelled out well enough in the initial agreements and meetings, and frankly, everyone works well together, and there's not like a lot of finger pointing and egos and things like that, then it can work. There's a lot of ways that it can not work if any of those don't line up.
I think coordinating those together sounds like a big task.
And where does it fall? Right.
Yep.
So I think that oftentimes that'll fall on the cybersecurity experts come in, because they're the spooky, scary person. And, oh gosh, what do we do? So if they come in, and as Matt mentioned, that's a maturity thing, right? If I step into a virtual room or a real conference room, either way, if I walk in and I go, this is the way things are, and this is what we're going to do, and that sort of thing, it will actually cause any sort of relationship, or chance of a relationship to evaporate.
So maybe let's layer on top of that, right? Cyber insurance is a hot topic now, right? So company wants to bring in cyber insurance, wants to figure out how to go apply for it, wants to figure out how to evaluate their options. How do you look to your MSP for assistance and advice and counsel as it relates to that, knowing at the same time the MSP is going to have to do a lot of things for you to be able to qualify for the insurance?
If you're taking it from that perspective, and it sounds like we're in this scenario, the end organization, have gone out and maybe sourced some quotes and came back with the questionnaire, bringing it to your MSP. That it's really not a horrible place to be, in that you have this dichotomy, right? You have a checklist of things you have to implement to qualify for cyber insurance. And if that's your goal, to qualify for cyber insurance, then great, you can go and do all those things and get your policy done. Now, does that actually make you secure, and is that a mature program? Not necessarily. If your only goal is to qualify to apply for the policy, then the checklist is actually can be a nice way to get your MSP to do what you need to do to get there. The problems come up when that gets emailed to the MSP and says, we assume you're already doing all this, right? That's where things really start to break down, and we've all seen that.
So maybe turn it around, right? You're the MSP, and you want to bring up the idea of your clients need to get cyber insurance. So they're healthy, they're better protected. It also allows you to talk about, continuity of service and availability of systems, and confidentiality of information. Is there an easy way for the MSP to bring up the topic of cyber insurance without making it look like they're just looking to provide more services that they can charge for?
Oh, that's that goes back to that seatbelt thing, right? If the MSP on their own side has a high enough maturity level, they're not looking at organizations that don't have cyber liability insurance. The way the global market has changed at this point is an organization that doesn't have cyber liability insurance is still in its infancy for the most part, or they've tried skipping out and they're escaping, right? In that case, neither one of those is necessarily a good match for a good managed service provider to actually come in and actually provide IT services. In the meantime, if you have one of those organizations, it often becomes a question of, back to the seatbelt thing. Hey, these are the things you're required to be able to drive the car, right? the other thing is quite simply, hey, we're taking a look. You guys have a lot of critical data. The larger you get, the more we're looking at, what sort of regulations, laws, dare say compliance, that you might have to have. And so for managed service providers, interesting enough, the compliance first methodology is a big thing that a lot of organizations adhere to, and compliance is important. But the problem is with the larger the organization gets, all of the different requirements from different compliances come flooding in. And so, a great example, of course, is you have an organization that needs to have a SOC 2 certification for something. So in the meantime, they're selling something, and they're running credit cards for the clients, and they're doing all this stuff. So they go out and they follow the trail, they get their SOC 2 certification. In the meantime, they've fallen out of PCI compliance because they're focusing on one thing and not necessarily the other. And so, my thought process on this is quite simple. Governance, interesting enough, while being the least sexy of governance, risk, and compliance, it's really going to be the most important thing moving forward, because you establish a security framework and you follow that, and that allows you to lower your risk, which allows you to get your cyber liability insurance, because that's what they're about now. And then, interesting enough, it drops down even further when you go to respond to compliance, because you're already doing those things. It's no longer a reactive system.
And Stuart, to your other point about talking to someone about this, it goes back to the value of having a long-standing relationship with your clients, right? If you've worked with someone for 5-10 years and don't have a history of upselling them things they don't need historically, then it's a very easy conversation to have. Now, if you do have a history of going in for every $1 a month uplift every 2 months, then you're going to start to feel the effects of that when you start talking about things that you really, really do need. It just goes back to treating your clients respectfully and fairly, and not trying to milk every dollar out of them. And if you do that, true consultative services, things that they really need, then it's super, super easy to talk to them about, here's something you need, here's why, and they'll not have that resistance.
While we're on this subject, we partner with Cysurance, and the output of the vulnerability management executive summary and scanning drops right into the questionnaire that Cysurance needs to be able to work with those clients to apply for the cyber insurance, either that the MSP wants, or that the MSP wants to provide cyber liability to their clients, or full-fledged premiums and policies for their clients to sign up with. Do you see, the MSP marketplace getting much more integrated with things like this to make it easier for the MSPs to do more?
Yes, I don't know exactly what form that will take, but anything that can help as far as streamlining that type of info. The difficulty, of course, is going to be, who's asking for what, and what do they consider an acceptable proof of that, right? If there can get some standardization around that, then I think streamlining getting that information from point A to point B is the next logical step. And I think there will be more of that. I just don't know that there is, at this point, an agreement as far as what needs to be provided and what's valid proof of it.
I think there are business requirements that are going to essentially force MSPs in that direction, no matter what. You already have, itemized, sections on these forms for cyber liability insurance that say, do you have EDR or MDR? If so, pick from this list. And, you already have those cybersecurity software companies that sell MDR, sell EDR. They're already going over to the insurance companies and going, hey, since you're now starting to evaluate for risk, and since a lot of these companies, a lot of these organizations have to have insurance, we want to be on your list. We want to see that drop down. And it's not necessarily always a sales tactic for them, but it is one of those things where, they don't necessarily want to be questioned for, well, you weren't on this list that I got from my insurance company, so I can't use you anymore, right? So that's what a lot of them are starting to do. I think managed service providers, while they're not going to show up on that list, they're probably going to start gravitating in that direction because of the types of services that they provide.
Well, I just think, as a small business owner, that's what I'm going to expect of my outsourced IT / cybersecurity / compliance / regulatory, / safety net partner of mine, right? And as an MSP, you're going to have to figure out, how do you articulate the value proposition around all of those things to your clients that work economically for you, and at the same time provide them the type of things they think they need from an expectation standpoint.
Yeah, for sure. It's a good point. I mean, you as the MSP may believe very, very strongly in your EDR or MDR tool, and if it doesn't show up in any questionnaires, you're going to have an optical problem with your clients, regardless of whether you're right or not.
Well, and I would think, that's a big challenge for the MSP, is to figure out what are the right tools, collections of tools, and integration needs to be provided so I can consistently provide, a high level response.
Well, I don't know if we can answer the tools, but I will say, if in my preceding example, if you really do believe that strongly in a solution, then deal with the optics problem. You chose it for a reason. Now that being said, it may be easier for you to pick something that's vetted and that shows up in the questionnaires and such. But if you have done the R&D and you've done the testing and you really believe something that's not on the list is the right way to go, then trust your process that got you to that point. Don't start changing tools just because of what shows up on the questionnaire.
Well, Matt hit it on the head, right? I appreciate the fact that insurance companies are really starting to invest more into, hey, you have to have these things because it really does lower the risk. But at the end of the day, you have somebody kind of, they're taking a look, they may do a quick search, right? And, they might find a list that a bunch of different providers have, paid to be on. And in the meantime, there may be some sort of up and coming piece of software that really does work better. And I will say that I've had this even recently where, we have a client come, they're like, this is not on the list. Does this count? Yes, it does. See, there's an other section. This is what we're writing it in, and then that's fine. Early on this year, especially when all the forms started, hey, last year, right, it was nice and easy. And then all these insurance forms started changing in January and people started seeing them. They're like, ooh, what do we do here? It used to be half of a page. I just drew a smiley face and they gave me an insurance policy and we were good. Now it's like, hey, there are 15 pages and there are 3 other documents that I have to sign and I have to make some sort of sacrifice here. Like, what are we doing here? So I usually tell them, take the rabbit back to the, find the rabbit a good home. We're not doing a sacrifice today. And, oh, by the way, we do test these things out. We don't have a choice because as an MSP, we have to have something that implements very quickly, something that works, 99% to 150% of the time, right? We want to overclock it as much as possible. We also, in the case of security systems and implementing security programs, we want them to help protect the organization. We want them to help lower the risk of that organization, of that client, from dealing with a security incident or, God forbid, a security breach.
So, Matt, kind of getting back to, the MSP trying to decide, right? How do they want to evolve, right? How do they want to evolve into offering, if you will, kind of maybe good, better, best, or maybe, small, medium, and high levels of cybersecurity solutions? How does an MSP, begin to go about that transition? Or can they decide I want to stay IT and desktop only, and I'm going to leave that to another partner of my clients to figure out?
Well, a couple of points there. One is when it comes to cybersecurity, the low, medium, high thing just doesn't work. Everyone's going to pick medium for every single time. What you should be doing is working to help customers figure out and determine based on their own risk assessments, and they probably don't know how to do a technical risk assessment. You need to help them with that. What do you actually need, and what are you trying to protect? And if you need this, this is our solution to that. And maybe have a second one, but that's not for the customer to pick. That's to have something around in case there's some kind of technical incompatibility, not an option really. I don't think there's really a place to only be I'm going to fix your office install and install your workstation anymore in the future. There are models where it could work, but I think from a competition and competitive standpoint, so many MSPs will be able to deliver the whole package in one that you just won't be able to survive.
Nick, any comment?
No, Matt called it.
So we just got a question submitted. Somebody asked, so if I have a client that I don't want to provide cyber security services for, or I don't think I can meet their needs, how do I articulate that?
You got to be honest with them and say, I can't meet your needs right now, and depending on how far off you are, you may be able to very quickly learn how to meet your needs. But if you're light years away from meeting their needs, I think you're doing both you and the customer a disservice to say anything other than I can't offer what you're asking for right now, which is that they may not be a good fit and maybe never were in the first place in that case.
So we got a question about.
Oh, go ahead.
Don't your panelists think that the time will come when you can go to your MDR, EDR vendor and say which insurance carriers have you on an approved list?
That's already happening. That's already happening now.
And is it causing problems for the MSP, or is it causing problems for the end user, depending on how the answer goes and how the conversation goes?
I mean, I think it goes back to the entrenched in what's been forever the business reality of you can only make that demand of your MDR provider if you're prepared to go to somebody else. And if you're with the only MDR provider that integrates with your tools, for example, then you can ask, but it doesn't matter what the answer is, you're sticking with them.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, at the end of the day, right now, the way the market is managed service providers themselves don't provide cyber liability insurance. We want you as an organization to have it. We want you to be protecting yourself. We want to help you protect yourself. But at the end of the day, if you're not getting a good offering from one cyber insurance provider, and you find out that, and if the MSP is actually working with the MDR vendor, they may actually go on your behalf and say, hey, where do we go? So at the end of the day, they're not necessarily concerned about that because the MSP is not making it onto the list.
Good point.
So I think one of the things, the title of this session was how does an MSP transition to providing cyber hygiene services? So I think we ought to go back to that, while we got a couple of minutes left. If you've got a large install base or a small install base of a few clients, and you're primarily providing IT support, what is the kind of process to figure out who you're going to offer what to, when, and how? And Matt, maybe let you kind of take that first, and then we can go to Nick.
Thanks, Stuart. I'm just going to come out and say it, and this may not be a popular answer. If you do have a large install base, your only option is to bring in someone who knows what they're doing. If you're that big, you cannot be figuring this out on your client's time and money. Like there's just no alternative. If you're smaller, you may have the opportunity with a limited client base and limited resources to grow with the organization and start to gain that experience. I have always found some of the methodologies and frameworks in some of the like certification books, for example, to be helpful. Now that what I'm not suggesting is to go read like the CISM book or something and like do everything it says, but to use that type of resource to start to get into the mindset of thinking like a security and like a risk management professional, and start going from there and thinking how you apply that to your own customer base. If you're just entering security, you're not ready to sit those exams anyway, but familiarizing yourself with the methodology is one of the best ways to start, even just to learn the right vernacular, to start talking about it with other industry professionals.
Nick, any thoughts on how do you navigate those waters?
I mean, Matt's right. I think the phrase "we bake security into our managed services" was applicable maybe 6 or 7 years ago. You can't say that anymore, because now the questions are, well, how do you do that? Do you just click some buttons on whatever piece of hardware you're selling me? Do you, are you just implementing, oh, well, you know how to turn on multi-factor authentication. Is that what you mean by baking security in? Or are you actually developing continuously running programs that are security based using, like Matt said, somebody who's experienced in cybersecurity? Okay, and you can't, cybersecurity professionals can't be built, but they can be made. And they're usually made through their experience. They're made through, they have the bug, right? You can usually see somebody who's cybersecurity, their ears perk up. They start talking about their Arch Linux machine that they've been playing around for 3 hours, that sort of thing. They love doing this. They have a passion. See how I got you there on that, Matt? So that being said, interesting enough, those are people that you want, that an MSP has to have in order to actually transition clients and organizations into cyber services more accurately. You can't just say, hey, you in the crowd that I just got out of college, that I just hired, you look like you could wear a t-shirt that says cybersecurity at some point. You're going to do security for all of my clients. It doesn't work like that. You have to actually home grow or look for those people that can actually help you.
So we got a question about CISA, and we've had some of the CISA folks on in the past, Bradford Wilkie and the like, talking about adopting the CIS V8 implementation Group 1 as a list of cyber hygiene kind of do's and don'ts. Have you looked at that? Can you comment on that? Do you know anything about what CISA might be producing?
So I mean, it's a good thing to do that. It's not necessarily appropriate for everyone, and that's where the difficulty and the experience comes in. For some organizations, that may be all you need to do, depending on their regulatory requirements and risk profile. For some organizations, that's nowhere near enough, and that's the part that takes skill and experience and wisdom. Going down that list and doing it, I don't want to say it's easy, right? The word easy should be banned in the entire MSP industry, but it's more straightforward, and making that decision is where your experienced security person earns his salary, figuring out what needs to happen.
Well, I'll tell you from our side, CISA has provided a monthly vulnerability management scan for free to clients that sign up for it. And then, of course, what normally happens is they do a monthly scan, and now they want to do it on a regular basis, on a continuous basis during normal business hours, when people are actually online and on, whether in the office or online and at home. And it's drove a lot of business to us, kind of by, I would say by accident more than anything else, because we were trying to promote a free service that CISA had to help businesses. But it has been a great kind of feeding system for us, if you will, to get people to take the first step. Maybe to that point, are there a couple of things, we've talked about multi-factor authentication, we've talked about vulnerability management, we've talked about cyber education. Are there things that, in a MSP that's providing IT support for a client, are there a couple of first few things that either they should be recommending or ideally the client is implementing, so they start to feel comfortable about what's in and what's not in what they're contracted for today?
Yeah, I have a few, but I feel like I'm monopolizing the floor. Let me let Nick talk.
Yeah, stop throwing me under the bus, man. No, it goes back to that seatbelt thing, right? I think that there's a certain number of base standards which we've talked about, but interesting enough, because of all the requirements from insurance providers and everything else, there's the regular seatbelt that goes across your lap, but then there's the cross section, I think, and I know that the original analogy told to me, hey, there's a full seatbelt, but interesting enough, in this case, I think that, having vulnerability management, managed endpoint detection response, security logging, having digital security awareness training, having monthly phishing simulations that are regular occurring, those are all kind of part of that component nowadays. And it's slowly starting to evolve into, you have to have all these things. And most organizations, small companies, are going, whoa, there could be some dollar signs there that they're not really expecting, that they don't want. And yet at the end of the day, a lot of the cybersecurity stuff, like vulnerability management, like MDR, those are actually investments nowadays. They cut down on your insurance premium. They allow you to go after business depending on your industry and your vertical. And that's one of the things that a lot of organizations hopefully can start to really see the benefit from these services, but that would be part of that new baseline, essentially.
I think what makes this I don't want to say tough, but interesting question is, at least for me, when you ask it, I'm thinking, MFA, isn't that like having a password now? Doesn't everyone have MFA on everything? It doesn't even seem like a thing you'd be recommending at this point. It seems like we should be all past that. If you're not, for some reason, if you don't have vulnerability scanning and MFA and logging, like Nick said, then yes, set all that up. But to me, stuff like that is kind of table stakes, right? You already have things like that in most organizations, or security conscious organizations. And if you have clients that don't have things like that, work on fixing that before getting you to the next step.
Well, I can tell you there's 17,000 auto dealerships in the country that have to now comply to the FTC requirement, and multi-factor authentication and vulnerability management scanning during, from a continuous standpoint, are two of the things on there. And the vast majority of them either don't have it or need an MSP to implement it for them. Yeah, there's some large dealerships that have an IT team, have a security team, and they're doing it themselves. But it is not even the 80-20 rule. I mean, it's more like the 5% rule that are doing that today. So,
Yeah.
I think it just speaks to, organizations that are trying to figure out, how do I meet the requirements for a new FTC compliance requirement that didn't exist 12 months ago. And I think you're going to see more and more of those activities taking place.
I do have a real answer to that question, and that is, Assuming you have the basics down, I'm a big believer in the value of identity management, and so my one suggestion would be spend both the time and money to get the applications you use under SSO if they're not already.
That's a great point. So look, we've got a couple minutes left. I want to mention a couple of events we have coming up. I mentioned the Nodeware live demo and peer Q&A coming up. If you have any questions, you want to see Nodeware demonstrated, you want to see how the executive summaries work or the reporting pieces, as well as how you can identify devices and sub them off from your critical data if it's not a vulnerability you necessarily want to go after immediately. Also, once again, I talked about this FTC compliance and safeguard. You know, we'll talk with a couple of people who are out helping dealerships do that today. We are fortunate to have a lot of our partners that are assisting those auto dealer consultants, if you will, and experts around compliance with some of the IT and cybersecurity issues that go along with that. So we have that session coming up on November 3rd. With that, you know, let me turn it back to the two of you guys, you know, just to go back to, you know, maybe kind of a closing remark from each one of you, you know, and maybe it's as simple as if you're an MSP and you're doing IT only and you don't transition to cyber, you know, kind of how long is your life and how does it work? And can you sustain that? And the other one is if you want to move to cyber and you plan on transitioning all of your clients, you know, kind of once again, a couple of thoughts on how you might do that from a methodical standpoint as well.
Well, I don't know if we can give an accurate answer as to how long your life is if you're not going down that road, only that the end will come if you don't continue to not go down that road. And to everyone's credit, everyone who I've ever talked to in the MSP industry is looking to make that transition. I don't think I can name anyone I've ever spoken with who said, I want to stay not doing security and moving up in the cyber hygiene stack. So I don't mean to imply that there are organizations not looking to do that.
But to that point, there's a lot of MSPs who have, you know, 90% of their business is IT only, and 10% of their clients are cybersecurity. And to your point, the 90%'s at risk at some point in time if they don't transition.
Yeah, and that's exactly it. It'll be a transition, and you know, whether it's self-directed or whether it's your clients are asking you for things, you are going to grow with those companies if you're looking to stay in business, or you'll go out of business. And exactly like Nick mentioned, if you can identify the right people in your org to start doing that, or if you need to bring in the talent to make that happen, then you'll survive and succeed, and you'll continue to grow with those organizations. And if you don't, or you can't identify that person, then you won't. I mean, I think it's probably that simple.
Nick, any thoughts from your standpoint?
Well, I think I think it's the concept of decentralized cybersecurity. A lot of managed service providers historically, okay, you know, back to the comment, well, we bake security in. Okay, so this person handles this thing, this person they report to different people. That's ending. Centralized security for managed service provider is becoming far more important. One, it's a better business model. Two, security does truly touch everything we do nowadays. And you know, I'll never forget a colleague of mine telling me a long time ago, well, Nick, you can't have security without servers. And I said, well, I disagree with that. And he goes, no, cybersecurity, it's snake oil. And I said, no, really, it's not. You know, we have houses, we have locks on our doors, right? That's not a, you know, suggestion. It's kind of mandatory nowadays, right? So same thing here. I think that centralized cybersecurity should be something that managed service providers should embrace.
Well, guys, I want to thank you very much for your time. You know, great insights, great perspective. You know, this is the challenging time for a lot of MSPs that have to figure out how to make this transition. It's a challenging time for their clients that are having to figure out how they move from IT only desktop support How do they fund it? How do they support it? How do they justify it? But they know they have to do it, right? And if they don't do it on their own, their board, their investors, their supply chain, their customers are going to demand they do it. Otherwise, they're not going to leave their critical data with them. So I want to thank you for your time. I want to thank you for your insights. And Matt will continue to do these on an ongoing basis on how do we help the MSP marketplace be more effective, more efficient, and how do they help more and more small and medium businesses that are going to be coming to them faster and faster needing assistance. So thanks for doing this with us. Nick, thanks for being on it. And I appreciate you guys taking the time.
Thanks, Stuart.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.